Well, good afternoon. I want to thank the organizers for this wonderful opportunity to participate in this workshop. Very happy to be here, and I look forward to hear all of you and to the debates. So currently I'm finishing my doctoral dissertation, and the title of my presentation today reflects the general subject of my work, so Spirit and Ethnography and Collections in Colonial Angola. Spirit and Fathers are a Roman Catholic religious missionary congregation created in France in the 19th century. They first arrived in Angola in 1866 and afterwards established themselves in Portugal in the following year. They became the dominant Catholic force in Angola throughout the first half of the 20th century, with their missions being supported by the colonial government. So today I will focus on the Spirit and Artifact collection held by the National Museum of Ethnology in Lisbon. The collection was donated in 1969 and was a result of an intense program put forward by the ethnologists of the museum, aiming to rapidly expand the collections and to assert ethnology as a specialized scientific field in Portugal, since the past decades had been greatly dominated by physical anthropology. So this collection comprises objects selected by the museum staff in one of the Spirit and seminaries, where there was a missionary museum created back in 1936. I won't address here the missionary museum nor the Spiritans' activity in Angola, but I am glad to answer whatever questions may arise afterwards in the debate. In turn, I will talk about the donation as a particular moment in the collection's trajectory, a moment which reflects on the part of the missionaries a process of detachment regarding the objects, and at the same time the consolidation of museum anthropology as a scientific field in Portugal, which hasn't received much scholarly attention. So my goal here is to look at the intersection between missionary ethnography and museum anthropology in the late 1960s. I want to understand what kind of dialogue and negotiation was established around the objects, and to question what this process can show us about the ethnologist's position towards missionaries. In general, my work aims to contribute to the history of these collections, both in their relation to missionary activity and to the history of anthropology. So I will start by looking at the political and scientific project of the museum to grasp what the ethnologists were looking for when they approached the missionaries. Then I analyze the donation, the cataloging process, and the collection itself. I will conclude with some thoughts on the ambiguous position of the museum despite recent approaches, and about the fact that ethnography had some aspects that brought ethnologists and missionaries together and also separated them. So since its inception, the Overseas Ethnology Museum depended on the support of the political field. It was generally in line with the dominant view of the Portuguese colonial politics after the 1950s, when a constitutional reform promoted the revision of the colonies as overseas provinces and recreated an ideology of assimilation, which came to be known as Lusotropicalism, which meant that Portuguese people had a special aptitude to establish intimate relationships with tropical populations, an ideology deemed to legitimize Portugal's colonial stance in a time when empires were falling and colonies were becoming independent countries. One side of this political reform was a new emphasis on colonial sciences. Thus, the museum was related to the creation of a Center for Cultural Anthropology in 1962 under the Overseas Research Board and connected to the Institute of Overseas Studies, former colonial school. There was a general conscience about the delay in the development of cultural anthropology as a scientific field. Anthropologist George Dias, trained in Germany, was named the director of the center and the museum as well. He is a central and controversial character in the history of Portuguese anthropology, being considered by many as the father of modern cultural anthropology, and his research in the north of Mozambique, having raised some controversies. So Diaz argued that ethnology was a branch of anthropology focused on the study of man as a cultural being. This study should be based on collected material from several human societies, so the museum was naturally the place where ethnologists could find a vast amount and diversity of such material. In his perspective, the main goal of the National Museum was to document Portuguese people from proto-history to the present. It should provide a perspective on how, I quote, a people of peasants, herdsmen, and fishermen expanded to the 5 continents, originating a widely varied forms of culture and creating an extremely original multiracial homeland. So the museum was indeed created in 1965. 3 years later, it already had around 18,000 objects. This growth expresses the sense of urgency that resulted from the political imperative, the need to make up for lost time, and the belief that ethnographic objects were disappearing. The ethnologists were pressured to develop a particular type of museum focused on the colonies, but they also wanted to enlarge that perspective and create something closer to a general ethnology museum. It should hold collections of reference, in this case metropolitan Portugal and the colonies, but it also should have other collections that enabled to expand its comparative potential. So they argued for, in Jorge Diaz's words, a museum of the Portuguese man, an expression that shows, despite some delay, the influence of the French model while embracing the project of a multiracial nation. So to put forward the museum's program, the staff followed scientific guidelines that aim to assure the quality of the collections. These were obtained either through field collecting or through the acquisition of private collections, which had inconveniences but was widely used. This second type of collections could include objects brought by first travelers, explorers, and missionaries, which made them unquestionably authentic, even if they were badly documented and followed an erratic principle. In the meantime, a systematic principle came to replace the erratic one, and the collection started being scientifically made to answer to scientific ends. In a sense, the acquisition of private collection by the museums also meant that it was possible to create scientific collections with erratic objects as long as these were authentic. So to understand this idea of authenticity is of course very important. In the museum's perspective, it referred to the reliance of the connection of an object's past or present to a specific culture, that is, the object had to be a part of that culture by use or function, so fake or new objects were excluded. In fact, authenticity and documentation were the main criteria for the scientific validation of the objects. Authenticity was vital because it was understood as an independent value, not determined by the ethnologist or collector, while documentation was more relative because it depended on the process of collection. Thus, objects without information shouldn't be excluded, if visibly authentic, because they could be documented afterwards. The study of these undocumented objects was based on the consultation of experts and on publications such as catalogues. Catalogues allowed for the public promotion of the institution and made it an institution of specialized knowledge and its collection a sort of reading grids in the production of that knowledge. So now I want to briefly focus on the first catalogue of the museum before passing to the part about the spirit and collection. This catalogue is important because it gives a perspective of the museum's collections and priorities before the donation. It was published in 1968 and was dedicated to African sculpture. The introduction was an essay about African art, a subject that was gaining renewed international attention. The author, the museum's vice director, didn't have a problem with the term art, but had a critical view on the artistic appropriation of African objects, limited to their visual and formal characteristics. For him, African sculptures as cultural objects betrayed their true meaning by being taken out of their context of use. So African art was essentially a functional art and mostly an art of magical and religious nature, a perspective shared by other ethnologists of the time. So these objects enabled an understanding of religious tribal life, which excluded Christianity. After the essay, the catalogue presented a selection of objects organized by ethnic groups, without mentioning countries, except in the map at the end. A brief analysis shows that, in fact, there was a balance between objects associated with Portuguese colonies and objects associated with other colonies. So this demonstrates the efforts to open the scope of the museum that I mentioned before. But Angola was still widely highlighted, including in the cover, which we can see here, reflecting also its dominance in the collections. The catalogue reproduced an archetype of an African ethnographic collection in which certain types of objects correlated with certain geographical provenances were always selected while others were excluded. These were the objects the ethnologists searched for when they visited the seminary. They were led by an idea of authenticity, by the need to fill certain lacuna in their collections, and by the favoring of certain objects such as magical and religious sculpture. So the Spiritans were an expectable target of the ethnologists' attention because of their centenary and almost exclusive presence in Angola. However, there were other dynamics in place that brought those two parts together. On the one hand, the congregation and the province, not to say the whole Catholic Church in general, held more than ever a favorable view towards the value of ethnography to mission work. On the other hand, the Overseas Research Board was intensifying its editorial policy and encouraged missionaries to publish their materials through the board's press. So in 1968, 1 year before the donation, Father Joaquim Martins, a Spiritan ethnographer, submitted his original manuscript of a dictionary of Cabindan symbols and proverbs, which were typically engraved in wooden pot lids, to the board. In turn, the board always asks for specialized scientific opinions on the manuscripts, so Jorge Dias was contacted for the job. His reply was positive. He thought the manuscript was worth publishing because it addressed an interesting subject and related to a cultural element, to use his words, located in a region for the most part included in the Portuguese province of Angola. Dias was familiar with both the subject and the work of Father Martins, since potlits from Cabinda were among the objects showcased in the catalogue. Knowing about Father Martins' work and most importantly his collection, Dias added an important suggestion to his review. He proposed the board to ask the author to offer his collection to the museum as a counterpart of publishing the book. Evidently, this gave the review the shape of an exchange, but in general, it also showed some recognition of missionary ethnographic materials depending on their nature and as long as they were filtered by the board and the museum. In other cases, he wouldn't be so kind when reviewing missionary manuscripts, being more prone to accept linguistic and popular literature works than actual ethnographic monographs written by missionaries. For example, a couple of years later, Dias rejected a monograph about Cabinda written by this same father. So Father Martins was satisfied for having his work recognized, but unfortunately he couldn't meet the suggestion. He had given most of his collection to the Spiritan propaganda organism and only had 3 potlids left, which he offered to the museum, along with their respective explanations. The book was published in that same year. So it becomes clear that in the eve of the visit to the seminary, the ethnologists were aware of the ethnographic materials produced by the Spiritans and already had contacts with them. The whole process took about 4 months. In the seminary, the ethnologists were surprised by the great ethnographic value of a small number of objects, to cite Dias, who reported the visit to the board. They went back to Lisbon, to negotiate the donation with the provincial father and inquire about other collections, namely that of another museum established in a seminary created in the 50s. The province accepted the museum's first request, not imposing any limits to the selection of objects, only demanding that the collection was identified by the name of the seminary, as indeed it is today. So afterwards, the museum stated the donation was a proof of the missionaries' patriotic sentiment and understanding of the scientific values. They also recognized the Spiritans' interest in the cultures of the people they evangelized. Missionaries were portrayed as contributors to ethnological science as a patriotic endeavor, at the same time as their interest in ethnography was acknowledged as a corollary of their well-adjusted religious action. In turn, the provincial father visited the museum to see the honorable place given to the collection. The visit and the donation were reported in the Spiritan Provincial Journal, but silence was kept about the other collections, which for other reasons they weren't ready to let go. So passing on to the collection, Dias reported that they had selected, and quote, 55 pieces, including fetish statues, most of them from the Bakongo of Angola, amulets and magical objects, almost everything of excellent quality. It immediately shows that the missionary museum met the expectations. So, as it is today, the collection includes 62 object entries registered both in catalog cards and ledger books. I analyzed both the collections, the objects, and the cataloging system because it reveals the creation of ethnographic information by the museum. In this archive, there aren't any missionary sources about the objects, nor even a report about the visit to the seminary, which could include oral information given by the missionaries. This absence clearly shows that the ethnologists were more interested in the objects themselves than in what missionaries had to say about them. It was the subsequent study to be developed in the museum that would allow for authorized ethnological information to be created. And this is a critical issue because the information about the collection in the Spiritan archive today is scarce. Besides the photograph I have shown before in a previous slide, it is probable that some of the objects were exhibited in missionary exhibitions that happened before, including the Vatican in 1925, but there are only indirect sources about this. So based on the museum, we can create a general overview of the collection, although, as should be clear, it may not represent the missionary museum. Compiling names and functions attributed to the objects, we get this table, which is a little bit excessive, I guess, and has names in Portuguese, but this is the general table compiling the object names and functions. So the first two conclusions are the dominance of objects that can be included in the general category of sculpture. 24 entries are named figures, and that have as function magical or magical religious, thus confirming the museum's priorities and selection success. So secondly, if we look at the place of acquisition and cultural group, it shows that the vast majority refers to Angola, with 3 exceptions of objects from Gabon, and within Angola, the regions of Cabinda and Congo referring to groups designated as Bakongo are dominant. Again, it is not unlikely that some of this information was given by the missionaries, but it's impossible to assess that. And also in catalogs where some of these objects have appeared, sometimes information appears about objects being collected in the beginning of the 20th century, which is it's difficult to assess where this information comes from, especially because the objects were part of the missionary museum created in 1936. But among these Bakongo objects, 18 stand out as fetish statues, 4 are boxes related to ancestors, and there are also 2 masks. Once again, we're looking at objects privileged in the introduction of the African Sculpture Catalogue, which exhibited mostly chokwe objects, such as the one in the cover. So this shows that the ethnologists were filling the lacunae in their collections, while at the same time relegating the missionary histories of these objects into oblivion. So to come to a conclusion, my main concern here was to examine what the ethnologists behind the creation of the Overseas Ethnology Museum in Lisbon, promoters of museum anthropology in Portugal, made of missionary ethnography and collections. In a recent interview given by the only living member of the museum staff, he stated that Portuguese administrators collected bric-à-brac, while Portuguese missionaries burned fetishes. Referring to the Puritans, he said that nevertheless they were able to assemble a valuable number of ritual objects, but they didn't have an ethnographic or artistic appreciation of them and held a caricatural perspective of indigenous religions. This kind of position has been interpreted as a sort of claim of humanity, which was meant to value African culture in a political hostile context, calling attention to the great political tensions that were part of Portugal in the 60s, especially resulting from the independence wars, during which the museum actually made scientific missions escorted by military. This idea of a humanist position parallel with the disqualification of missionaries' motivations in opposition to the positive qualification of the objects suggests that the missionaries were seen as agents of colonialism, and their ethnographic perspective was hostage to that condition. However, my research shows that, more than a clear ideological stance and its present appeal, the ethnologists' position was more ambiguous, and their contact with the missionaries were driven by a demand of authentic objects, while also the urge to establish ethnology as a scientific field. To keep up with their project to finally create an ethnology museum in Lisbon as late as the mid-60s, missionaries and other groups with long-lasting presence in the field had to be approached, and resulting contacts were of exchange and mutual recognition in a moment when both parts looked like they were, to a certain extension, on the same side. The museum wanted to assert itself, centralizing and producing ethnological knowledge, defining the criteria for its validation and priorities. They were interested in the authenticity of the objects and ethnographic information collected by missionaries, but they also selected the objects and the manuscripts they deemed scientific and rejected others. In turn, the Puritan province was interested in the public recognition of its contributions to the ethnological scientific endeavors supported by the Ministry of Overseas. Interestingly, their dedication to indigenous peoples was then seen as both patriotic, thus colonial, and progressive, showing sensitivity to indigenous cultures in the eyes of the ethnologists, the politicians, and the public. Although, on the other hand, the 60s were a very complex decade for the Catholic Church, and in the Portuguese Puritan context, internal crises emerged, and these reflected criticisms from younger generations of missionaries about their purpose and the collaborationist position in Angola, most of them having lost any connection or interest in collecting objects or in the missionary museums, which started to perish and came to an end by the end of the 60s and the 70s.